Uh, Brian is a coworker of mine. He works for WS Audiology, and I'm really pleased to see him. But I would go see him if he was down the street at the theater as well. He's really entertaining and very fun. Um, I read some of his bio here, and I didn't know half this stuff. So he has been around a while, which is kind of cool. And he's still doing it, and he seems to be having fun doing it. So that's kind of cool. Um, he is for right now. He is the director of scientific and product marketing for WS Audiology. He also is the editor for Audiology Practices and it's a quarterly journal uh, for the Academy of Doctors in Audiology. And he's the editor at large of Hearing Health and Technology Matters. He's a leading industry blog. I don't happen to get that one. Dr. Taylor is nearly 30 years of experience in both clinician and also in business management and a university instructor. His most recent textbook, Audiology Practices Management, was published in 2019, and his third edition, uh, selecting and fitting hearing aids, was published in 2020. So with that, I'm anxious to see what he has to say about this next subject.
All right, Gary. Thanks for having me. Good to see all of you. I'm going to just dive right into the material. You see here from my screen what the title is. Why do we match targets, and what might be new about prescriptive fitting methods? This is going to be about an hour of time. Thanks again, Gary, for the nice introduction. I don't need to go into all that. Here are the course objectives. I want to try to address these questions. Why do we match targets? What new wrinkles could you add to your real ear repertoire that might improve the success of your fittings? And these are the 3 wrinkles I'm going to talk about. I'm not going to get into them now. Well, you'll see when we get to them what they are. But it's always good to kind of think about this question right here. What is the recipe for a successful fit? So you can kind of think of yourself as this guy stirring up this big pot. In my mind, these are some of the ingredients for that recipe. Good audibility. Obviously, many things fall into place when people can hear soft sounds, average sounds, and loud sounds. When that happens, usually speech understanding can be optimized because you can't understand something if you can't hear it. In addition to that, we want to make sure that sound quality is reasonable, that loudness is appropriate, that loud sounds are not uncomfortably loud, and that everything is sort of acceptable to the patient. And of course, we have a couple of different formulas that have been around for many, many years. The NAL, which comes from Australia, based on thousands and thousands of patients and what they prefer as far as loudness is concerned. And by the same token, some researchers up in Canada 40 or so years ago developed a very similar formula called the desired sensation level, or DSL. We won't get into the details. Essentially, they're not exactly the same, what they call for when it comes to gain for soft, average, and loud. But as years go on and as more data is collected, those 2 prescriptive formulas get closer and closer together. They're much more similar than they are alike. So anyway, as you all know, if you're matching targets, this would be a good recipe for a successful fit, and it requires a balance of these things. All right, let's talk about fitting targets as kind of the gold standard. So the question in my title, why do we match targets? The real answer to that is there's not really a better way to do it. And of all the other possible ways, they have much bigger downsides than using probe mic to make sure that a target is matched. That's why we sort of call it a gold standard. We know that there's several factors that go into making a successful fitting, as I just mentioned. And we know that a whole lot of research has looked at how we balance those factors, and that's been used to develop the prescriptive targets that we all rely on. And as I mentioned, today, there are really just those two targets that everything else is kind of based on, the DSL and the NAL NL2. The NAL, as you all know, is by far the most popular in the US. The DSL is used, but mainly if you're into pediatric audiology. One thing that I want to point out here at the beginning is that just by going into your favorite manufacturer's fitting software and clicking on the NAL NL2 target doesn't mean that you're necessarily using what I will call the true NAL. Once a hearing aid company has paid for the license to use the NAL NL2, they're allowed to make alterations to that target and still call it the NAL NL2. So I can just about guarantee you all manufacturers change the NAL target that's in their fitting software. It's been common practice over the years for manufacturers to usually roll off the gain in the high frequencies. This is less common today than it was, say, 5 or 10 years ago. But still, I think it holds true across manufacturers. When you click on their version of the NAL NL2, especially gain for soft is much lower in their iteration of the NAL, much less gain in the highs, especially for soft sounds, compared to the tried and true NAL. So just because your fitting screen may show fit to the NAL, it is not a true fit to the real tried and true NAL. And just as an example, here's the Signia fitting screen. You go in and you find it defaults to the manufacturer specific target, but you can go in and you can change it to NAL NL2. And that's great. In fact, when Signia sends hearing aids to the VA, they do that as a matter of default. It defaults to the NAL NL2. But again, it's important to emphasize this point. Just because you click on the NAL NL2 in this software doesn't mean you're getting the real NAL. It rolls off a fair amount in the high frequencies, especially for soft inputs. So the real NAL and what's in the fitting software are two different things. And even if the NALs, even if you clicked on the manufacturer's version of it and it was the true NAL, there's some other things that we have to be concerned about. One is the software is always programming to average. And we all know that individual ear canals vary, other things vary. So the average sometimes can be very different than the individual. And we won't get into real ear coupler differences. That has to do with the size, the dimensions, the volume of the ear canal. You could have two patients that both have a 70 dB HL hearing loss at 2K. If one person has a really small ear canal and the other person has a really large ear canal, the dB SPL to get to that 70 dB HL threshold could be as much as 15 dB different between the two ears. We account for those differences by something called the real ear coupler difference. And I just want to point that out. Most of the time, these things are based on averages. We also know the venting and the way that the ear tip or the ear mold fits into the ear have a big have a big effect on the fitting. So really, because of all these things, the only way to really get a true idea of what's happening at the eardrum is to place that probe into the ear canal so you can see what the sound pressure level is being generated through the hearing aid, through the vent at the eardrum. In other words, everything you see on your fitting software of your favorite hearing aid manufacturer is what some people say a cartoon. It looks good. It might look like a great match on the fitting software, but until you stick that probe into the ear canal, you really have no idea how far off you might be. So a few other sort of background pieces of information around probe microphone verification, real ear measures, why we do them. I think it's kind of good to make sure that we're grounded in this. Um, we know that today's validated prescriptive fitting methods provide research based on ear canal SPL targets. We don't think about gain, we think about SPL in the ear canal. Some of you might be familiar with real ear insertion gain, where you do a measure before and you get actually there's some value in doing this. You place the probe tip in and you measure in the unaided condition without anything in the ear, just the probe tube, and you get a nice curve of the ear canal resonance. Then you place the hearing aid in and you rerun that. The difference between those two curves would be real ear insertion gain. We don't look at that as much as we used to years ago. We kind of, when we do real ear aided measures, we're looking at everything sort of together. And we'll talk more about the second point more tomorrow, but the goal of the fitting simply to obtain real ear output that's within plus or minus 5 dB of the target. I'll talk more about why plus or minus 5 dB is a reasonable approximation of matching the target tomorrow. We know that speech mapping is out there, live speech mapping. It might be a nice way to kind of demonstrate how a patient hears their spouse's or their grandchildren's voice, but because there's so much variability in speaking levels, intonation, things like that, live speech mapping is not a good way to match a target. We have other types of input signals that use speech that are calibrated that are much more reliable. So those calibrated signals are really the best and really the only validated approach. Also, to make sure that we're grounded around real ear measures, I threw this in there. This kind of shows you all of the different parameters that we look at on our screen. So regardless of the specific real ear equipment that you use, they all pretty much show these things. We have the patient's thresholds. You see the X's there. You have the fitting target, the NAL or the DSL or the manufacturer's version of it. That's the dotted line. Then you see the amplified long-term average speech spectrum that's generated in this case by what's called the ISTS, which is a simulation of many different languages that kind of give you a broad spectrum of calibrated speech. Then you see the shaded area around it. That's accounting for the peaks and troughs of speech, which is about 30 dB dynamic range. And then at the top, the U's, you see the measured LDL. So that's sort of, I think all of you are familiar with this. I just wanted to make sure that, our job is to make sure that that amplified LTASS is close, plus or minus 5 dB to the dashed line. And that's basic standard real ear measures. But as we'll talk about today, there are several other little things you can do to verify a good fit beyond just matching a target. So as a baseline, target matching is a good idea. That's the best way that we have to know that audibility is being and comfort are being optimized. But as we'll talk about today, there's some other things that you might want to look at. Anyway, what I just talked about, I kind of put it in this slide. We don't have to get into the details. I think all of you do this on a routine basis. Measure at soft, average, and loud, 55, 65, and 75 to get within plus or minus 5 dB of the target. And of course, on the right, you see what is often out of the box, where there's a poor match of the targets in the highs. versus after you've done some tweaking and seen what it looks like on the probe mic screen, how you've bumped up the gain in the high frequencies to match those targets. So I'm guessing that's something that all of you do on a daily basis. And of course, that little extra time, placing the probe in, measuring at those multiple input levels, and then bumping up the gain as necessary, shaping the response. I think all of you know that that effort can make a tremendous difference. I wanted to point out, and this is where you can fall into a little bit of trouble if you rely on the manufacturer's first fit algorithm. Every manufacturer has their own version. In the Signia software, if you don't do anything, I showed you the drop-down menu with the NAL and DSL on it. If you don't go to that menu and just leave it in the default, it's going to use what's called IXFit, which, as you would expect, provides less gain than what either the NAL or the DSL formulas would call for. Every manufacturer has some proprietary target, and all of them undershoot the NAL, some by a little, some by a lot. And what you see on this slide is some data that came from Mike Valente, who used to be the director of audiology at Washington University, very busy clinic, medical center. And what it shows you here is just how much average air for soft at the top, average inputs in the middle, and loud inputs at the bottom there is. And it just shows you that the average air in the high frequencies for soft sounds is 14 dB, 8 dB for high frequency average sounds, and a little bit less for loud sounds, only 3 dB. The important point here is it might look really good on your fitting software, but when you match the target in the actual ear, even though it might look good on paper if you're using the proprietary target, when you look at it compared to the NAL, you could be off by as much as 10 or 14 dB on average for soft high frequency sounds. Now, how does that equate when you miss a target to word understanding ability? And what happens if you move from first fit to what we'll call a programmed fit, where you're matching the real NAL target? What I want you to notice here, we have words correct on the y-axis. You see from 0 at the bottom up to 100% on that left margin. And then you see your soft, average, and loud input levels across from left to right on the x-axis. What I want you to notice is for first fit, where the hearing aids are programmed to the manufacturer's proprietary target, when there's a soft input used for speech, for measuring speech understanding ability, say the NU6 word list presented at 50 dB SPL, which would be just above a whisper, notice that for the first fit, the average score is about 65%. If I take that very same hearing aid and I program it to the NAL target and verify that I've successfully matched that NAL target, that very same hearing aid for soft speech understanding goes up from 65% to an average of about 80%. That's a really important point, and it shows your value as a fitter. And it also illustrates that when you take the hearing aid out of the box and you don't do any fine tuning to match the NAL target, it's very common and really expected that that person is going to perform less than we want them to, especially for soft, understanding soft speech. Now notice for average and loud at 65 and 80 dB SPL, the first fit and the programmed results are very similar. So where you really see the biggest difference with not matching the real NAL target is it equates to less than expected poor word recognition for quiet sounds. And I would argue most people, when they get hearing aids, especially people that have milder hearing losses or high frequency hearing losses, this is one of the most important things, is their ability to hear quiet speech. And it's just not likely to happen if you match a proprietary first fit target. Um, Another important point that I want to illustrate is that a lack of audibility from these proprietary fittings has a huge impact on speech understanding and background noise. Uh, this is some data that comes from Ron Levitt. I think most of you are familiar with Ron and his work. He's an audiologist in Oregon. This shows you the relationship between audibility and speech understanding and noise as measured on the quicksand. And what you notice here on the y-axis, on the left margin, the more negative the number, the more difficulty or the poorer the score for speech understanding and background noise. And what you notice here is that these are 6 different hearing aids from 6 different manufacturers. And the black bar is showing you, when they're programmed to the manufacturer's first fit, how they do as far as understanding in background noise. Those big negative numbers tell you that with that first fit, people are really struggling in background noise, and they're struggling in background noise because they lack audibility. The hearing aids are simply not bringing in enough sounds. Now you take those very same 6 hearing aids, and all you do is reprogram them to the NAL target, and then you verify that match on your real ear screen, and you get a dramatic amount of improvement in word recognition ability and noise, simply because you've optimized audibility. So when people talk about differences across hearing aids and how some hearing aid manufacturers might do better with speech understanding than others, that's really a lot of bunk. The most important thing is, any hearing aid, when it's programmed or tuned by you to optimize audibility, does quite well as far as restoring speech understanding ability and background noise. It doesn't really matter the manufacturer. It just matters how well you can make that hearing aid optimize audibility. And that's the importance of matching those targets, the NAL or the DSL. Anyway, enough on that. I wanted to share with you 3 new wrinkles that you might want to consider in your probe mic repertoire. The first is not really any new procedure. It just gives you maybe a little bit of insight on how matching a target equates to improved speech understanding ability. And there's something called the Speech Intelligibility Index, or the SSI. As far as I know, every probe mic manufacturer provides this reading. And when you know a little bit about what this reading means, it can maybe speed up the process a little bit. If anything, it helps you know that chasing after a couple percentage points improvement probably is not worth your time. Anyway, the Speech Intelligibility Index essentially is based on what's called the Count the Dots audiogram. Mead Killian and Gus Mueller developed this about 30 years ago, I think in 1990, and then they updated it again about 2010. And essentially, this is a handy little tool. Every dot, there's 100 dots on the screen, and every dot has the same equal contribution to understanding speech. Notice that many of the dots are packed between 1,000 and 4,000. That's where the greatest density of dots are. And that kind of illustrates the point that the most important frequencies for understanding speech are between 1 and 4,000 hertz. And it also shows you the dynamic range between 20 and 50. It's about 30 dB of dynamic range. So the idea here is you want as many, I don't want to say you want as many dots as possible to be audible, but you want a nice amount that are in that 1 to 4K range. Anyway, this is an example of aided versus unaided thresholds. So the bottom series of X's would be maybe the, well, not unaided and aided. This is kind of showing you, you put the hearing aids on and they're on in first fit mode. That's the initial aided thresholds, the bottom set of X's. And if you were to count all of the dots below that bottom line, it would be 45, or that equates to 45%. Then you take that very same hearing aid and you match the NAL target. Notice how many more dots now are below the X's. If you counted them up, there would be 80, and that's 80%. So you can see just by improving audibility, how much that changes the SII on the count the dots audiogram. You almost doubled the percentage simply by matching the real NAL. Now, the thing is, now, if you had an incredible amount of time, you could sit down and you could do an aided audiogram and literally do this, what you see here on the screen, but it would take you several minutes and it doesn't really make a lot of sense. And there's a margin of error with any type of behavioral test. Fortunately, you can get the same thing by through your probe mic system and the way it calculates SII. So the speech intelligibility index is a really nice predictor of speech understanding. Here's the model. You see speech intelligibility index on the x-axis, and then you see the predicted speech recognition as a percentage. And what I want to point out here, if I could get my handy little telestrator, is that what you're looking at on this slide, I'm not sure if I can, I'm having a hard time seeing my cursor, but it's right up here where this line starts to bend. Notice that it doesn't take, that's a really, we call it a steep function, and it doesn't take the speech intelligibility index as a percentage often is much lower than we think in order to get to that 90 or 100%. If you notice here, we're at 100% and the speech intelligibility index is only 50%. That might not seem like a very high number, but when it comes to this steep function, just getting 50% on the SSI often equates to 100% of the predicted speech recognition ability of the person that you might measure in the sound booth. Anyway, this is a handy little way to better understand speech intelligibility index. I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time seeing my cursor. Anyway, a little bit more about the SSI. It was developed back in the 1940s, and at the time it was called the Articulation Index. And I don't know, about 25 years ago, they revamped it and renamed it, called it the Speech Intelligibility Index. And basically, it's just a number of expresses a percentage of how much of the speech is audible. The higher the number, the more of those dots are audible. And usually we're looking for an SSI around 65 to 75% to be acceptable. And as I mentioned, at least the probe mic equipment that I'm familiar with, automatically calculates the SSI for both the unaided and the aided for both soft, for all input levels, soft, average, and loud. And you see it here. There, in this example, the unaided was you entered the audiogram in, and it tells you that the unaided SII for this individual, you see the audiogram there on the screen, is 28%. But then when I put the hearing aid in and I presumably match a target, it shifts the SII from 28% to 73%. So essentially 73 out of the 100 dots are audible. Now, one of the things I want you to be thinking about would be, well, wouldn't it be nice if I had 93 or even 100% of the dots audible? Is that possible? Is that something that I want to chase after? It would sort of intuitive to think that 73, it's a big jump from 28, but why not spend the time to try to get to an even higher number? We'll talk about that in a second. But before I do, here's another example. Notice for soft, as you would expect, in the unaided condition, it was 7, and it jumped all the way to 44. And for loud, it was 28. That's not surprising when you consider that when somebody raises their voice, if somebody has, even if they have a hearing loss, there's a good chance they're going to hear some of the speech. In this case, they hear 28 dots. And then when you put the hearing aid on, 28 goes to 78. So one of the things I want to kind of walk through here is, isn't it enticing to think that we could go to 100? Is there a downside to going 100? Is it worth our time to go to 100? Well, here are some reasons why more audibility, going from say 78 to 100, is not always better and actually can be kind of detrimental. For one thing, if we try to chase after 100%, go after all 100 dots, it increases the likelihood that we might run into some feedback. And of course, if people get feedback, even with a really good feedback canceller, you still could run into it, and a person would end up turning their hearing aid down anyway. Another reason why we don't want to chase after 100 is because sometimes it makes loud sounds too loud, and then a person turns down the hearing aid for all sounds. Sometimes it makes the sound quality unacceptable. And I mean, sometimes we talk about cochlear dead regions. We're not getting where there's a person might have a lot of distortion. It might be somebody who has really poor word recognition. And of course, I think we all know that we run the risk of making it sound even more distorted when things are loud, and it makes their word recognition even worse than it was before. So anyway, it's not worth the time chasing after 100. Often it's not even worth the time chasing after 90. What I want you to notice here is that in one probe mic manufacturer, I think this is Verifit Audio Scan, there's a range. See those black bars there. For soft inputs for this particular hearing loss, they're saying that the SSI in the aided condition for soft sounds should be between those two black bars that express the lower and the upper limit. And you can see in this example, 64 is right in between those two black bars. If I saw that, I would leave it alone. I would not try to chase after a higher number. So a few other things about fitting to targets. We know that there's a range. We know that the hearing aid style, venting, all those considerations, you can account for them when you match one of these targets. And this group from Western University in Canada actually developed a couple of really handy tools that you can use to better acquaint yourself with the SSI and if you're on the money, which I want to talk about next. So these next 3 slides, you might be able to find them in the Verifit manual or on their website, or you could just take a screenshot of these next 3 slides and use them, because this kind of shows you, it gives you a ballpark of if the SSI that you see on your fitting screen is appropriate, or if you need to maybe turn up and chase after more of the dots. So what you see here, let me see if I'm having a hard time getting my telestrator to work here. I don't know if I can do this, but I may have to move on. Let's see. Here we go. What I wanted to share with you is, whoops.
In the upper right corner, you can change your view if that helps.
Okay, thank you. I think the problem is my mouse is kind of flaking out on me here. Here we go. Let's say, okay, I'm gonna so we got a 55 dB input, and let's say that we have a 4-frequency pure tone average. I think it's 1, 2, 3, and 4. You take the pure tone average, you calculate it, and let's say it's 55. And I draw a line straight up, and anything in this area right here would be a good match of the SII. So for a soft input, and the person has a 55 dB pure tone average, high frequency, so a moderate loss. If you get an SSI in the aided condition of around 40, that would be pretty good, and an indication that you don't have to chase after more dots. You don't have to make it louder. So you can take these 3 slides, calculate the patient's pure tone average, and then you can see if you're in the ballpark when it comes to the SSI. And they've developed them for soft, average, and loud. All right, so that's as much as I'll talk about with SSI. It's a handy tool. It's a good way to know if you're in the ballpark with respect to audibility. And it's a nice way to know that it's probably not a good idea to make things too loud. More audibility is not always a good thing. It's the right amount of audibility. The second new wrinkle that I wanted to talk about is what we call the real ear aided response for an 85 dB input. Some people might call this the real ear saturation response. That's an older term, but this is really making sure that loud sounds are not too loud, but at the same time, loud sounds are in the right place. Here's some recent survey data that essentially says that I don't know, about 1/3 of hearing care professionals measure the real ear aided response at 85, and about 1/3 do it sometimes or not at all. So when we talk about the real ear aided response 85, we're really talking about setting the output compression, the AGCO, making sure that it's not too hot, but that it's not too cold, and that it's just right. And when you start to see things like too hot, too cold, and just right, I think that reminds all of us of the Goldilocks tale. When it comes to making sure that the output is just right, there are 3 ways that you could do it, and you see them listed here. You could let the manufacturer do it. You could use average values based on the degree of hearing loss, or you could measure the patient's loudness discomfort levels and then use your probe mic system to make sure that the MPOs are just below the aided LDLs. So let's talk about each one of these 3 options individually. First one, let the manufacturer do it. This is a very risky proposition, and let me tell you why. Even though it might be tempting because it saves you time, here is one study that looked at all major manufacturers from just a couple years ago and how they set the output in their hearing aids. So in this particular study, they ordered a hearing aid from all 6 of the major manufacturers, and they programmed this hearing loss and those LDLs into the hearing aid. They actually didn't program the LDLs. They relied on the NAL to make the predicted LDL calculation that you see there on the screen. After they did that, they took the hearing aids and they measured an REAR 85 on all the patients using those predicted measures. And this is what they got. The only one that was close to the predicted value was the gold line at the top. The other 5, especially the 4 that are there in the circle, undershot the predicted values by about 15 dB. In other words, if you relied on the manufacturer's predicted setting, you're shortchanging the patient loud amplification for loud sounds. It's basically cutting it off. It's like putting a ceiling, taking the ceiling that might be 9 feet tall and making it 6 feet tall. You're losing a lot of headroom by relying on the manufacturer's predicted values. And I'll give you an example of how that can be a real problem when you're fitting hearing aids. Let's say that you have a patient that takes their hearing aids that's been fitted using one of the methods in the red circle there, one of the manufacturers that default to a really low MPO, around 80. And that person walks into a background noise situation, and I think all of us know it's not uncommon to be in a noisy restaurant situation where it might be around 75, even 80 dB SPL. And this person is wearing hearing aids where the maximum output is set at around 75 or 78. And as I showed you here, that's pretty common. And when her friend, who is across the table, raises her voice, the lumbar effect, to be above the background noise, her friend is talking at around 80 or 82. Well, when she talks at 80 dB and the MPO is set at 78, that means the hearing aid is essentially cutting off, reducing gain for those loud sounds. And when the patient says that they're not hearing her friend very well, maybe she doesn't sound very loud or she sounds muffled, when she comes into the office next week for an adjustment, I think it's very unlikely that most of us would think that the MPO is the problem. We might be trying to change gain for soft and average, but if it's an MPO problem, those adjustments to gain are not going to make any difference. But if we went in and we bumped up the MPO to say 85 or 90, that would very easily solve this particular problem. So the first option here, let the manufacturer do it, is probably not a good idea. Let's go to the second option. We have average values, meaning we can take the average values, we can take somebody's threshold, and we can maybe predict from that threshold what the LDL would be, and we can enter that LDL into the fitting software. So for example, let's say somebody's threshold at 2000 hertz is 75. Is it possible to say that their LDL might be 100 and just take that number 100 and enter it into the fitting software? Well, the answer to that is you might be a little bit closer than option one, but there's still a tremendous amount of variability when you rely on predicted LDL values that are based on thresholds. Here's some data from about 20 years ago that shows you just how much variability there is in LDLs as it relates to thresholds. What you see here are the 2000 hertz threshold of 508 ears. And notice we have everything from 20 out to 100. And then that line that you see in the middle of all of the dots, that's the average calculation. So for example, if somebody's threshold at 2K was 60, that would tell us that the predicted LDL would be about 105. But the point here is that there are about 60% of the values are either 5 dB louder than that, and another, so 30% are 5 dB louder, and 30% are 5 dB or softer than that. So using that as a prediction, predicting somebody's LDL based on an average might get you a little bit closer. Only about 30% of the time would you be within plus or minus 5 dB. The other 60% of the time, you're likely to be off because there's so much individual variability in loudness discomfort levels. So using average values is probably not a good idea, but it's certainly better than option number one. So really the best way to find the best MPO setting for a patient would be to measure their LDLs, which we're going to talk about next. I won't get into the details here, but it's there. Just like you measure thresholds, there's a specific process or procedure that's used to measure frequency specific LDLs. And it's spelled out right here using an ascending method in either 2 or 5 dB steps. I think I have a picture here. Yeah, here it is. You use these loudness anchors. There are the instructions. You ask the person to tell you which of the 7 loudness anchors, what the tone, what category it best matches, and you want to make sure that you find out where their 6 is, and hopefully it's just below, but not a 7. So you want sounds that are loud but okay, not uncomfortably loud. Here's an example of how you would do that under headphones. This process takes about 5 minutes. You could do this on the day that you fit hearing aids if you wanted, if you had a little bit extra time. You would take that HL value and you would convert it to SPL. Some hearing aid manufacturers do this automatically, meaning if the person's measured LDL is, say, 105 dB SPL at 2000, it would change that value to 110 dB SPL. Or you could take the values that you see in the second bullet point and you could change the HL to SPL and then enter that information into the fitting software. That's what step number 3 is. You would enter that information into the manufacturer's fitting software, making sure that you've used the correct, you've used the proper correction factor, as I shared with you in the slide before. And then you would enter that information. It would change the fitting screen a little bit. Then you would do your real ear verification with an 85 dB SPL input. And you basically are making sure that the line that you see there is just below the U. Typically, when we do aided LDLs, we only do them at 2 frequencies. The best frequencies are usually at about 500 and about 3000. In this particular example, you would probably bump the MPO down just a little bit in the highs, so it's below that U, and then you're pretty much done. Now, if you really want to pay attention to detail, there's a 5th and final step, which would be behavioral verification, where you could put the patient in the sound field and then repeat the same procedure without probe mic, getting the patient's aided LDL in the sound field, using the same approach with those loudness anchors. Here you see an example of it. You want the sounds at 500 and 3000 to be loud but okay, a 6 but not a 7. And that's a nice way to verify that with tones that things are loud but okay, but not uncomfortably loud. So those 5 steps, 4 out of 5, I think, are pretty critical. The 5th one is kind of a nice to do, but that's a nice way to ensure that the porridge is not too hot, it's not too cold, and it's just right, that the loudness is just right. Now, if you want to read more about that, Gus and I did a series of these research quick takes. In fact, what you're seeing today is kind of a summary of some of the things that we've done. You can find specifically what I just talked about at this one if you want more details. That brings me to the 3rd and final wrinkle, and that is measuring what's called the real ear occluded response. This is a really good one to do, especially if you're fitting a lot of devices with ear tips, with non-custom ear tips. And I'll tell you why in a second. So why is it helpful to measure the REOR? Here are some of the basic reasons why that would be. More than 90% of RIC devices are dispensed with a non-custom instant fit ear tip. And of course, you know that there are many advantages to instant fit ear tips. They're comfortable, patients can wear them. They don't get pressure sores. They're almost invisible. You can't even see that they're there. They're typically pretty easy to get in and out of the ear. They're convenient. You don't have to order an ear mold or take an impression. You just pop it on there and away the person goes. But they do come with a couple of really big downsides. And those downsides, we don't want to ignore them, and we want to account for them. And the best way to account for the downsides, as we'll talk about, would be to measure what's called the real ear occluded response. So what I'm going to talk about next comes from this article. You don't have to know the article, but basically, I think all of you have seen this chart. This is the venting chart. It was published by Harvey Dillon about 40 years ago. And it shows you basically the larger the vent diameter, the more high and mid-frequency roll-off. This is sort of a classic point that everybody learns when they get their license. And it's not wrong, but this only applies for conventional parallel vents. Conventional parallel vents are an impossibility in any sort of an ear tip. So what you see here are what happens when you fit somebody with an ear tip that you think might be closed, but in reality, it is far from it. On the left, you see a round with a small vent in it. So we're thinking we're getting a little bit of venting, but you can see the dark line is the average, and then the grayer lines are showing you the individual data. And you can see that some people have a significant amount of roll off, even at 750 and 1,000 hertz. And that applies with double domes. We think a double dome is really closed, but in many cases, there's a lot of sound that's leaking in and around that vent. And the reason why that is because it's not a parallel vent. It is what's called a slit leak vent. And slit leak vents, because they're not running along the entire length of the ear canal like a conventional ear mold, even a small little leak has a lot of low frequency and even mid frequency roll off. So this is really important to note. You think you're fitting somebody with a highly occluding double dome, maybe because they have a significant hearing loss in the lows and in the mid range, but because of slit leaks and not being seated in the ear canal properly, you're getting a whole lot of low and even mid frequency roll off. And of course, that has some issues with the software. You have to be really careful about how you enter this information into the fitting software. The fitting software can think that it's a closed fitting, and it can give you these big, you see this on the right, because it thinks it's a closed fitting because of what you entered into it. It's showing you these calculations where there's a lot of mid and high frequency, a lot of low and high frequency gain. But in reality, what you see here on the fitting screen could be very different because of those slit leaks. It also affects in a big way when you start to roll off the lows and the mids. Directional microphone responses, digital noise reduction is not working in the low frequencies. In this example, because of all the low frequency roll off that's resulting from that leakage from the ear tip, all of that sophisticated processing below about 750 hertz is not being utilized because it's not going through the hearing aid, it's going through the vent. And we talked more about this in a couple other quick takes if you wanted to go and have a deep dive. So anyway, long story short, I think it's really important that you measure the real ear occluded response. It's very easy to do. You stick the probe into the ear canal with the hearing aid turned off. That's the important thing. The hearing aid is turned off and you're measuring, you're basically measuring the hearing aid as, and the coupling as an earplug. And of course, if you're fitting a lot of devices with ear tips, it's probably not going to be acting so much like an earplug. But if it's a truly occluding, say a custom mold with a pressure vent, it's pretty common to see about 15 or 20 dB of attenuation. And it's going to be less than the real ear unaided response in the high frequencies. So here's some examples. You see the real ear unaided response in green. You see an open dome, which is a pretty close approximation in purple. Then you see a tulip dome where there's a little bit of roll off in the highs. And then you see a power dome where there's a considerable amount of roll off above 750. But notice at around 500, with an open dome, because of all the venting, power dome or a tulip dome, there's really little change. So here's a couple of teaching points. When you're fitting somebody, it's common with these, especially with a really open ear tip, that the real ear occluded response will masquerade as the real ear aided response. For example, the curve here in red is the real ear occluded response. And as you would expect, because it's, relatively occluding, we're getting a lot of roll off in the high frequencies. And because of some venting, you're getting little in the lows. But notice then when I do the aided response, which is in green, notice how where the blue circle is, there's no difference in the gain aided and unaided. That's an example of the real ear occluded response masquerading. The way to fix this problem would be to change the coupling to get rid of that little bump in the green and go back in and retune it after you've changed the coupling so you get a better match of the on the dotted line. Another issue with the real ear occluded response you see with music. So here's an example, the real ear occluded response in purple, the real ear aided response in green, the difference between the hearing aid turned on and turned off while it's in the ear. And because it's an open fitting, you see low frequency gain. You think that's pretty appropriate for music. But in reality, this is the vent, it's vent transmitted sound there on the right. My point is, when you use a lot of ear tips, the real ear occluded response can tell you where you might have to bump up low frequency gain to get it above those venting effects. And there on the right, you see how they had to go in and bump up the low frequencies or change the coupling to get better results for streamed music. So a couple of things here I wanted to point out. I think it's important for patients that want to be able to listen to music through their hearing aids. A couple of things that we have to think about. One is, do they want to listen to music through direct Bluetooth streaming? And if that's the case, sound is traveling through the hearing aid, but too much of the low frequencies is attenuated due to the venting effects. And the remedy would be, if you really wanted to fix that problem, you really can't bump it up so much with your software, but you might have to change the coupling to one that has maybe a bit smaller, better controlled parallel vent, and you'd find that in some type of a custom ear mold that would work with a RIC product. On the other hand, if somebody's priority was listening to music via loudspeakers, there's a real possibility if you're fitting somebody with an ear tip, even a double dome, that you're going to have a large slit leak vent, and much of the sound is going to travel through that unoccluded ear canal. And again, the remedy is the same. a custom ear mold with a parallel vent. You could achieve the same thing possibly with a more closed ear tip, but as I've showed you or tried to show you previously, there's a lot more margin for error. There's a lot of variability. And if you go with a custom ear mold that snaps into the RIC receiver, there's a lot less variability, and you can control the low frequency response more effectively.
Brian, are these things you're also going to delve into tomorrow morning?
Yes, we're going to go into more detail tomorrow. Yep.
We are right about at our hour mark.
Yep. We're at the hour mark, and this is a good time to stop because some of these things we'll talk about tomorrow. I will leave that for tomorrow. Those are those are 3 new wrinkles. We don't have time for questions, do we?
Could you go back to that screen real quick?
Yep.
Excellent. Thank you. If anyone has any questions, please go ahead and unmute yourself and speak up. We are looking to next take a half-hour lunch break. Anyone have any questions for Brian on this topic?
You'll see me tomorrow, so you can save those
I was
questions
going to say,
for them.
like I said in the beginning, I think maybe we just digest the information, and there'll be more of it tomorrow.
Exactly.
So,
all right. I'll let you guys enjoy your lunch, and I will see you tomorrow morning.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye now.